Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Royal Television Society event looking at the challenges of journalists covering the war in Ukraine. We know that news crews are often on the front line, but just this week we've seen the human cost of bearing witness to conflict. So far in this war, 5 journalists have died, 35 have been injured. And this session is going to look at the physical and mental health risks associated with that of journalists covering a major war, and some of those journalists will be covering a conflict for the first time. All of them, of course, will have come straight off covering a global pandemic where both as organisations and as individuals, our resources have been somewhat stretched. So we'll examine what it's like for the journalists currently in Ukraine, also the journalists here, the processes surrounding editorial decision-making and the challenges of a 24-hour news environment. So the social media that comes with that, how newsrooms are dealing with propaganda and verification and impartiality. And on our panel, we have the BBC's World Affairs correspondent, Paul Adams, ITV news editor, Rachel Corr, Sky's Director of News, Jonathan Levy. They'll all give their perspective from the newsroom. And joining us live from Ukraine, hopefully, is Vice News correspondent Hind Hassan. Now, Hind is currently filming in Kharkiv. She does want to join us, but you'll understand that the signal is pretty poor at the moment. So we may be bringing her in at some stage. I don't know whether that's Hind now in a car. Hi, Hind, you've joined us. How wonderful. We've just started. We know that you're en route. So given the reception issue we may be facing from Ukraine, can we go to you first, Hind?
Of course, just to make you aware that I'm currently driving outside. We've left Kharkiv now, so that's good news, but there are constant checkpoints here. So there are occasions where someone might open the door and we have to give our details out,
Sure.
and then the internet comes in and out. So just in case it falls out.
Well, we really appreciate you being with us. Firstly, where are you going and how are you?
And well, the team as well, we're all together. We have left Kharkiv after spending quite a few number of days here. We're heading towards another safer location, which is nearby, which is not too far. It's been difficult at times, definitely. There have been moments of quiet, but there were a few days where there were an increase in airstrikes on the city, and you could hear ingoing and outgoing fire quite a lot. And we were very close to some of those strikes. So we're the lucky ones that we get to leave the city and go somewhere safe, hopefully, because obviously there are a lot of people there, civilians, who don't have that option to leave. So it's always it's quite a sad moment, because even you feel happy that you're leaving, but you know that there are many people who don't have that same privilege.
Yeah, I saw a piece that you filed last night, actually, where you were talking about the explosions that you could hear in Kharkiv. Was it your decision, yours and the team's decision, to leave? Did you make that decision on the ground, or was it back at base that they said now's the time to move?
Well, we're in constant communication with our security team back in base, and we're also talking to each other all the time. That's the most important thing. When you go into these conflict zones, these war zones, you have to make sure that every single person is comfortable on the team. You don't want a situation where there are people who are somewhere where they feel pressured to be there. We're also working with local Ukrainians, and their experience of being in something like this way surpasses our experiences, because, of course, as being here and working as journalists, they're also, some of them are displaced, and they are now internally displaced or refugees, and they're witnessing the cities that they've lived in and grown up in being destroyed, and they're watching the victims of war, which are people that they, have maybe known or seen, or they might have been to university there. So it's really important to ensure that every single person you're working with is comfortable, and our security team has also reiterated that over and over again. And so I think after spending a few days there, and we have done a report, and that will be going out next week, we made the decision that we shouldn't stay in the city and we should go somewhere safer.
Yeah.
It was a collective decision.
collective decision. And how many of you are there?
So there are 6 of us in the team, which is quite big. I know a lot of teams don't work like that. There are, you know, many teams which are much smaller. At Vice, we try to film with 2 directors of photography. That is a luxury, I know. Sometimes we only film with 1. We have local producer and the vice producer and our wonderful driver here. So it is quite a big team. It's a lot to manage.
It is a lot to manage. I mean, you have experience, I know, of conflicts past. You have reported from Iraq and the Sudan, Chechnya as well. How does this conflict differ from those?
So I think this colleagues that have, you know, worked in the 2003 war on Iraq, or that were in Gaza, inside Gaza when it was bombed over different years, I think they might say that is something that would be closer to it. I didn't do those conflicts. For me, in terms of a lot of the places that I've been, there is a clear front line of fighting, and you can pull back to somewhere that is relatively safe. In terms of Kharkiv, the city that I was just in now, there are front lines of fighting. They're very, very dangerous. But the issue is that the city itself is only 30 to 40 kilometers away from the Russian border. So the reality is that the whole city is a potential target for airstrikes. And so even though you have days where it might feel quiet or safe, it's not really. And we saw that just a few days ago. I think it was Monday, actually, when we were out. It had been relatively quiet over the few days that we'd been there, and we were filming. And then there was just the most incredible strike sound, and you know, we all ducked to the floor, and we found out that there was a missile that had hit a building which was just around the corner. And then also there was also an I think it was a missile. There's also a missile
Hind, I think we might be losing you.
That was just 1 or 2 buildings down from our hotel, and that's we're talking to people, and it feels normal, and it just changes within seconds. And so I guess that's how it differs in terms of when we were in Azerbaijan, you know, there was a front line. That's where we would go to. The same in Iraq, or the same when we went into Gaza, the airstrike had already finished because Israel hadn't let people in.
Mm-hmm. Hind, we're just, I can hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can, but your video just froze. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you go for a while. And thank you for joining. And we hope to catch up with you a little bit later on in the hour if we can, when we've sort of re-established the line. But it's been great getting your perspective, and I hope you and the team can stay safe, and thank you for everything you're doing there. Hind Hassan, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I think Jonathan Levy, if we can bring you in, because it was quite interesting.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Hind. It's interesting what Hind was saying about the difference, I guess, in conflict, and sometimes we see now that even if you wear a flat jacket with press written on, even if you're driving a vehicle with press written on, it doesn't necessarily protect you. And I mean, you're director of news gathering at Sky News, and in charge of a very large team of news journalists and technicians. But your chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, and his team were attacked, as we know, near Kiev. The camera operator, Richie Mockler, took 2 rounds to his body armor, and Stuart was wounded. And 3 producers, one of them were local, were also with Stuart's team. Can you just bring us up to date with how they all are now?
Yeah, hi, Sean. They are okay. They're back. They've been back for a week and a bit now. So they've left Ukraine and they're back in the UK, and they're in decent shape physically, and just kind of decompressing and working through the experience, which was a very, very intense one. One of them, Andre, the local producer, is in Lviv, of course, which is where he's with his girlfriend and family now. But the 4-strong team of Sky staff team are back and doing okay. But it was clearly a very, very difficult and harrowing experience for them. They, as it's turned out, they were the fortunate ones. People have had similar experiences since, which have been less fortunate. So they're very conscious of that, as we all are.
Yeah. And I noticed you mentioned a local producer, and of course news crews rely on local fixers and producers, and they of course are putting themselves at personal risk as well. How do you make sure that you manage their safety as well as your own teams? And also that I'm just thinking too about that mix of experience. Some people will have not been used to conflict, but it won't be their first conflict, whereas for others it will be. How do you manage that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. In terms of local teams, I'm sure it's the same for all of us. When people are working for us locally, they're treated and looked after exactly the same. They're equipped in exactly the same way. We consider the duty of care to our local producers and drivers in Ukraine to be the same as we do to the staff that we send from the UK and elsewhere. So there's no real difference there. I'd say where it becomes more difficult is when the team came back to the UK, we were able to support them properly in terms of any physical recovery they needed, but just as importantly, any kind of psychological, emotional, and mental recovery. That's been more difficult with Andre. It's been me over kind of WhatsApp and Google Translate, trying to encourage him to get the right support and saying we'll support him as we can. So that I'd say is the big difference, is the kind of aftercare. While we're all together, they very much are part of the team and are looked after the same. So I think that's a big difference. The point about the blend of experience is a really important one, and that team happened to be, every single member of that team was extremely experienced in that kind of work, and when they found themselves in that situation, that definitely made a huge difference, because they all stayed very calm and all were able to formulate a way out of it, a successful way out of it, mercifully. But in any team, we're always thinking about the balance of experience. With a story like this, there'll be very, very big deployments, and some of the people going will be people with less experience of hostile environments. Hopefully not no experience, but less. And you have to think about the combined experience of all of them and make sure that you'd never put a team together where everybody has little experience of this kind of environment. You try and blend it, but everybody has to start. Everyone who's interested in doing this kind of work or is going to do this kind of work is going to do it for the first time at some point. And the idea is to put them with people who have more experience, from whom they can learn, and that the overall blend of the team is the correct one and a safe one.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the sort of psychological aftercare in a wee while, but I wonder whether, as this seems to be a little different with the press being targeted, and so in a way, does it matter how experienced you are if that is the outcome? Whether the incident with Stuart and the crew has led to a different way of thinking, whether you are going to change the way you do things or things stay the same? Was it just a bad piece of luck?
Well, I think we're all learning as journalistic teams and broadcast journalist teams. We're all learning the whole time, both as individual organisations and collectively, about how we can make operating in these types of places safer. I think what's common amongst all of us is that all our organisations think it's absolutely vital to be there and on the ground to witness these stories and report on them if we can, and to work out how to do that, to do that in as safe a way as possible. I think there are different levels to it. The situation that Stuart and his team found themselves in could have happened to any team. Hind was talking earlier about the kind of front lines. I think one of the unique things about this conflict is, certainly around Kiev, the front lines are very fluid, and you can find yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time. It can happen, and it did happen to Stuart, and that's not a matter of experience really, because they were a very experienced team. I think the reaction to the situation they found themselves in did draw very much on their experience. Everything from where to put themselves in the car in that particular situation, how to extract themselves, get away from the situation, and all the subsequent responses. So yes, of course, you're right. No level of experience is going to stop you from necessarily finding yourself in that situation. If it was to, then it wouldn't have happened, because that was an extremely experienced team.
Yeah.
But where
they knew what to do.
They did know what to do.
Thanks, Jonathan. Rachel Corf, if I can bring you in here, editor of ITV News, and full responsibility as well for the editorial direction and policy and staffing across all ITV outlets. I mean, you've got around 15 people in Ukraine at the moment, and obviously more in the surrounding countries. What governs your decisions about where to go, what to cover, who to send? Where do you start?
It's a very inclusive process, and it's talking to a lot of the people involved in terms of once they're on the ground. Any decisions about where to go, the first conversation is with the team and what they're picking up on the ground, what they feel, what they're getting from talking to people locally, from talking to security contacts, and you know, if they don't want to go somewhere, that's it, end of conversation. And that has to be the starting point, and I'm sure that's the same for all other broadcasters, and it has been for decades. We can supply information we're seeing from London and give extra context and build up that bigger picture, but first and foremost, it's how they feel on the ground. In terms of planning ahead of the conflict that we didn't know what form it was going to take, was a really difficult decision, and tribute to our for our news gathering teams for working that out. And we did put people in Kiev, we put people to the east, we put people to the south, and then we brought people into the west. As it turned out, we seemed to be in the right sorts of places, but nobody knew what this war was going to look like. So planning for it was terribly difficult. And then it's been a question of being a bit agile and working out where the story is, but where you can tell it relatively safely. And again, that changes all the time. So it's a constant dialogue and a combination, of intel on the ground and us here. Clearly, once the scale of the conflict and the war was clear, it was a question of sending people into the surrounding countries as well, and the refugee story, which has been incredibly powerful as well. But it's ongoing all the time, and we keep updating on that.
Yeah, and I guess as there are sort of three bulletins for you, you know, you've got the lunchtime, the evening, the late audience. Actually, you've got the morning as well that you've got to provide at weekends. What decisions do you make about what's appropriate for each time zone and what you use? Because I noticed on the news at 10 last night, your anchor Tom Bradby actually referenced the AP material that had come in, and it was ghastly material from Mariupol, and they must have put themselves at huge risk to get it. But that must have been a decision that that you took, where you thought these people need credit.
Yeah, that was a pretty unique situation. I can't really think of anything similar, but we did have a team in Mariupol who got out just before the really bad shelling happened, and they did tell stories from there when they were out. But I think we've all been aware of AP continuing to have a team in there despite this incredible danger, and getting out some of the most powerful images of what it's like. And I think we've all been reporting as best we can using UGC and social media video, trying to get a sense of what's going on there, but it's been pretty difficult. And they managed to get out some really harrowing but compelling footage last night. And actually, on this occasion, we thought we need to credit their eyewitness journalism and their eyewitness reporting, rather than us using agency the way we all do as a part of a piece. And they have been doing something pretty unique the last week. And it was really, really dreadful footage. I'm sure lots of people have seen it. But it was a story that needed telling. And I think not only was crediting them right, we also explained to our viewers what it was and why we were doing it, and perhaps why we were showing something that pushed the boundaries on what people traditionally would be able to see and what we might broadcast. It was horrific, but we felt viewers needed to see that. There's no sanitizing to be had around this war, and not least with peace talks going on or other information coming out, really trying to show some of the real horror that was going on. And credit to AP on this one, that they were the ones able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, you do have to sanitize some of it, because some of it you cannot show an audience, and we'll go on to that in a moment. But just, I was interested, you mentioned the sort of using the UGC, and obviously this is a war where there are social media posts, there are viral videos, there's sometimes outright propaganda. How do you manage that and verify that the footage is what it says it is, if sometimes content is posted anonymously or through digital middlemen? How do you verify?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's talking about this being a social media war or a TikTok war or whatever else you like to label it. I have to say it's not new. I mean, the Arab Spring, the first 2 or 3 countries, we all had cameras there and we were able to witness it. And then Libya and Syria, they kept the cameras out. So it was something that we had to find other ways to tell that story, and searching for images and trying to work out, is this what it says it is, and what actually is the story? Now, clearly things are a lot faster and more sophisticated now. We set up a special verification unit, we call it, with several people in it, dedicated to working in it. And there's a lot of different things. And some of it is a question of talking to other people on the ground and trying to verify the images with what we've got on the ground. Some of it is around geolocating, trying to work out exactly where this video was taken, because we know there's a danger of people putting out something from 10 years ago. And there's been examples of people claiming images from Syria or in Ukraine. A bit of reverse image searching, checking where it says it is, cross-referencing with other types of UGC, a lot of liaising with other organisations doing this, like Bellingcat or the Centre for Information Resilience. And again, talking to our teams on the ground, we had there were some images from Mariupol that we had in our report yesterday. Now, our team had been in the same spot a couple of weeks before, so they could say, yes, we know that that is where it purports to be. But, you know, it's ongoing, it's difficult. There's a lot there. As you said, there's propaganda, there's disinformation. And I think it's erring on the side of caution if necessary. But this is such a key part in telling the story. And there are very brave teams getting right up to the front line and getting in, but there are some places where we can't get to. And so we are relying on this different type of eyewitness accounts to be able to say what exactly is going on.
Right. Okay. So it's a balance, isn't it, between the sort of expertise and the eyewitness stuff as well. And Paul Adams from the BBC, if I can come to you, because you were in Ukraine in the build-up to the war and as it started, what was it like then, and how do you think it shifted since?
I mean, it was a very strange time. The 2 weeks in the build-up to the war, you know, you were living in a city that was entirely sort of at peace with life, just, you know, going on absolutely as normal, and you were constantly being asked in live interviews, you know, what's the mood in the city? And I always felt slightly fraudulent. I had the same slightly boring answer, because at the same time, and it always seemed to be after dark for some reason, there were these briefings by Western intelligence officials painting the most unbelievably apocalyptic visions of what was about to unfold. And it was really difficult to try and have these two completely different mindsets, you know, going on in your head at the same time. And I think it did, you know, there was a sort of perhaps a skepticism about what Western officials were saying. There's a lot of talk about, you know, whether Britain and America were sort of in some way playing things up for some particular reasons. I think it did give us all a chance to think ahead about what might actually unfold. And I think this was one of the really interesting things in terms of how organizations prepare for something like this, is that, you know, people were still pouring in the weekend before the war began. I mean, the weekend before Putin's horrendous speech on the Monday night, we were still, you know, our teams were being boosted. And there were people who were coming in who had absolutely no idea that they might find themselves 4 days later on a kind of front line. They brought their flak jackets. They thought they might be sent to the east if the fighting, you know, developed there. They did not think that they were going to wake up at 5 o'clock on Thursday morning to the sound of explosions. Now, to some of us who've, you know, been in Gaza and elsewhere, and heard these things and have a vague understanding of, you know, when to be afraid and when not to be afraid, you know, it's still startling. And, you know, the sound of an air raid siren is sickening, you know, the 100th time you've heard it, you know, not just the first time. But it was quite shocking to see just how quickly it was distressing to people who had not been in that situation before. And I think, you know, maybe people need to be thinking about, were we being imaginative enough? Were we crediting enough these warnings beforehand? Because I think, to be honest, to put people in that situation, I found it distressing to watch young colleagues visibly upset and needing to get the hell out of there as quickly as possible. You know, I think Jonathan talked about the mixture of experience, and that does definitely play. I mean, I felt, you know, it wasn't something that I'd gone there planning to do, but I felt myself needing to be in that position to tell people not to worry, that, you know, that things were okay, that we can take a fairly rational view of what we're seeing and hearing around us. But being in a war at the very beginning, which I've never been before, is very different. When I arrived in Sarajevo, the war had been going on for 18 months. Everyone knew where you went, where you didn't go, what the front lines were, what the rules were. In this case, you had no idea.
Which must be really frightening. And I completely get what you're saying about all of a sudden war taking journalists by surprise, some of whom do not have your experience. We worked together actually covering the conflict when I worked for the BBC in Yugoslavia. You've also worked in Afghanistan and Iraq and various other, and you've come under attack yourself, of course, in 2014 when you were filming tensions on the Turkish-Syrian border. Did you feel that you were under threat? So were you worried about your own personal safety as well as that of others?
No, not really. I had the misfortune, just as the war was about to begin, of catching COVID. So I was kind of isolated in my room quite a lot of the time, and kind of exhausted by the previous 2 weeks, which was an extraordinary roller coaster of diplomatic efforts and just, you know, the threat of war that seemed to come and go. So I was already tired. Then I got COVID, so I was completely shattered. I was on the floor physically, and I realized just how vulnerable mentally that makes you. You are much more prey to fear and anxiety when you're tired than you are when you're fit and well. So I did, you know, a bit of that crept in, but at the same time, no, you could tell that the explosions you were hearing were very distant, that these were the prelude to something that could, you know, over time become much more alarming and threatening. But I didn't feel that you know, I was in any personal danger. In fact, after the first night of sleeping kind of down in the bunker, but trying to keep away from the others because I was still testing positive, I actually just returned to my room and thought, well, look, if I do start hearing things go bang in the middle of the night, well, then I'll go down to the bunker with everyone else. So experience does definitely play there. You know, when you've heard it close up, when you've heard it far away, when you have a sense of incoming and outgoing and all of those things, it does prepare you for dealing with a situation like this, even if it is quite novel.
Yeah, and before I throw this open to the panel as a whole, when you got back, what kind of help did you and your team get?
So we left long road journey from Kiev to the Moldovan border, crossed finally, you know, much relief in the team I was with, about 6 people or so. And it was the middle of the night, and literally within about half an hour, the phone started ringing with someone from London saying, here's the plan. You're going to go to a hotel in Romania. You're going to stay there for a couple of days. Someone's coming out to meet you. And in the van that night, I think we all thought, to hell with that. We want to go home. We want to get home quickly now. And then we all tumbled into bed at about 4 o'clock in the morning, woke up the following day and thought, yeah, we're going to stay here. This is a good idea. We're together. We have lots to talk about. And by the way, somebody really qualified and expert was coming out from London who I knew and was, you know, I was looking forward to having a conversation with her and discussing it all. And so she came out, she talked to us collectively. She sat down with each of us individually, went through this TRIM process, the trauma management process, you know, asked us a lot of questions, said, we're going to have this conversation now, we're going to have it again in a month's time. And then after about 48 hours, we all headed home. And, you know, it is, some of this is modeled on the old Falklands War experience, which was at the end of that war, one of the things that helped veterans was that their process of leaving was a very prolonged one on board ship together with their mates. Now, this was nothing remotely as traumatic as that, but that's the sort of model, and that's the idea that if you stay together, have that decompression, peace and quiet, the ability to chat it through, you're off to a good start.
And it's a very effective one. I was TRIM trained, trauma risk management trained about 15 years ago, I guess, when I was at the BBC. Then it was quite hard to get journalists to come forward after they'd come back from something difficult. I think that the conversation around mental health and resilience levels has changed fundamentally since then. But yes, it was designed by a military psychiatrist, that debriefing. And certainly my own research with journalists and mental health shows that processing with people who understand, who are often there with you, is one of the first steps towards being able to deal with it subsequently. But I mean, Jonathan, there is still a risk, and you talked about that psychological outreach that can sometimes be hard to give, not just because perhaps your fixers and your producers are far away and it's hard to get to them, but also because typical trauma response will be avoidance and withdrawal, that kind of, I'll box it all up and put it away in the back of my head and I'll attend to it when I've got time. So what kind of support, mental health support, I guess, are you giving at the moment?
Yeah, so as you say, the whole support around journalists returning from conflict zones, or the whole appreciation of mental health support within the industry has changed hugely over the years, as it has changed in society as a whole. I think the big thing that we have picked up on, and you referenced it, is there's still a residual reluctance maybe to access support that you might be offering. So you can put out as many notes as you want, telling people there are phone lines that you can call to access expert report. You can call people who've come back and say, please do follow up on this if you need to, but many won't. So what we've done is we've slightly kind of changed the emphasis, and what we look to do is, from when people to come back, is they get contacted by a specialist in trauma and the after effects of trauma, who call them up and have that initial conversation with them, and then a follow-up. Just a little bit of opting into that, but what we try to do is switch it round, so you don't have to seek it out, it comes to you. So that first conversation is one that's effectively initiated by us with a specialist, a trauma specialist, someone who's independent of all of us. It's not a colleague. I think that we think that's very important, because otherwise, undoubtedly, some people who do need help won't get it, because there is still always, as you say, there's a reluctance to come forward and get this kind of help.
But also, I think, Jonathan, with those, certainly my research suggested that it was freelancers and also those at the start of their career who were quite reluctant to ask for help in that way, because they were worried about career harm, effectively, or that they didn't feel that they had access to the support.
Yeah, absolutely. Freelance is absolutely a key one. That's we're not using many freelancers from the UK. We're almost completely using staff. But yeah, freelancers is definitely one. Younger people, it definitely is more experienced people now who have a greater awareness of this. And then, of course, as I was talking about earlier, local staff, that's harder. You're very conscious of the fact that it's much more difficult to provide that support to people elsewhere, where those resources are just not as available. But we don't doesn't stop us trying.
No, of course, of course. And Rachel, by the way, I'd just say that to anyone watching this live, if you have any comments, questions, suggestions, then put them in the chat box and I'll get them and put them to our panelists. And it'd be great to hear your thoughts on what we've discussed so far. Rachel, we had a session just yesterday, didn't we, with your ITV news team about mental health, and then we were starting to see the pictures coming out that we talked about earlier about the difficult images coming out from Mariupol, and one of my, I'm in the newsroom in the Channel 5 ITN newsroom here today. One of my colleagues contacted me and said there seems to be a compulsion to watch images that sometimes you don't need to watch. So how best do we manage that when we need to look at it in order to know what's appropriate for the audience, but also to know what to include in the packages at any given time. But we also know that, you know, again, there's research which suggests that those who watch online images are at risk of post-traumatic stress disorder, because it goes from the screen into your brain. And I know that one journalist a few years ago, after Syria actually, told me it was like living through a Tarantino movie. All the time, because once you've seen it, it was impossible to get out of your head. So bearing in mind, we are now seeing quite a lot of this stuff. How best do you protect your teams in the office?
Yeah, and it's, as we were discussing, this isn't just about the people in the field, and of course, really, really crucial to protect them and when they're back and in the weeks and months after they're back, as you say. But this is something that more or less everybody in the newsroom is being swept up in, and it's a lot of this isn't that new. We had it with Syria, with the Arab Spring. We had these problems before. I think there's an intensity and a volume of it now, and it's relentless. And it's a lot of talking to those people, and we are holding sessions such as the one we had with you. But I'm talking about it in the newsroom all the time, and it's a lot of our youngest. And we've got a lot of new people have come into the newsroom recently, and this will be the first time they are experiencing that. And with our verification unit and others, it's a lot of talking to them and saying, you need to take breaks, you need to get away from this, but also it is no sign of weakness if you're finding it upsetting. It doesn't make you a lesser journalist. It's not about bravado. I have stood up and talked about how upsetting I find them. The cumulative effect of these is making me cry when I see them, and it's discussing with them. It's okay to take a break, to flag if you're struggling with it, and very much all our mental health support is for these people as well. It's not just for the people who've been in Kharkiv or Mariupol, but it's constant conversations. But interestingly, after you particularly flagged the AP material yesterday, I did walk around all our units and our foreign desk and our digital team and said, there's some material, you don't have to look at it. Yep. And very much for that. And some people said, oh, great, good, I won't do. And I think however tired we are, however many days this has gone on, we just have to keep reminding on it. And there's nothing good about being desensitized. There's nothing good about getting to a position where, oh, I can watch all of this. But as I said, for some people, we all did this 10 years ago. We did it with Iraq. We did it with the Arab Spring. But there's a lot of new people coming into it. And I hope that the mental health conversation is so much more advanced these days that it's an easier thing to have. But I think it has to come from us at the top and leading, and the sort of grisly experienced people admitting that they find it tough too, and that it's okay in that sense.
A couple of sort of psychologist tips and tips that I've picked around in the newsroom as well is watch it on fast forward. Actually, that came from one of my colleagues this morning, because if you watch it at a faster pace, it sort of slightly distances the reality of it, and maybe that will make it easier. Also, perhaps watching the video, but not necessarily the audio connected with it until later, so that again that gives you a little bit of distance. Minimizing the screen so that you can contextualize everything around you, so that you know where you are, you know that you're not in that experience, but you're here. And as you say, breaks and letting people know that there's no compulsion to watch.
I've never known if it's scientific, but I also stick my hand over most of my screen. So
well, again, you see what that is doing is just your brain is going, I'm in a safe place, because there's actually all the stuff that's present around me. So when our brain goes to an alert state. But it is something definitely to watch for. Paul, I wonder whether I can go back to you about the propaganda and verification that we talked about earlier, and whether the intentionally incorrect material that is distributed by both sides makes it harder to get to the truth sometimes. I mean, how are broadcasters like you guarding against something like this?
Actually, let me just say one thing on just while we were dealing with trauma. It's not just about gory pictures. When you're in a place, in a city under siege, there's a whole other dimension to trauma, which is, you know, you develop very quickly bonds with the local people, whether they're the hotel staff or your local fixers. And when you leave them, all sorts of other things are going on emotionally, which are also part of that whole trauma experience. So I think, you know, when actually when we went through our trim process in Romania, a lot of questions were about, you know, these sorts of things, not about, because none of us had actually seen a thing at that point. We'd heard some distant explosions, but there was plenty of other stuff that needed talking about as well. On the whole sort of, you know, propaganda thing, yeah, it's phenomenally difficult. War is inherently difficult to understand. Most people have no idea, you know, what's the difference between a tank and an APC, what's the difference between artillery and missiles. You know, the terminology, the language, the concepts are entirely alien to almost everybody in our audience. I had a brief spell as defense correspondent long time ago. I've forgotten most of what I learned at the time. It gives me a slight advantage with some of this stuff. But you just have to pay an awful lot of attention. One of the flip sides of isolating with COVID was that I got to spend a lot of time staring at my computer at images and maps, and occasionally having incredible Twitter conversations. I mean, there was one day, actually it was before the war even began, there was something that was going on down in the Donbass, and it felt like it might have been a false flag thing. It was late at night, and suddenly I found myself making instant Twitter friends among engineers and military experts and people who were doing geolocating and a bit of Bellingcat type stuff. And just between us for about an hour and a half, we examined a particular thing and kind of figured it out, which was amazing, actually. I mean, it was Twitter as a kind of actual real-time news gathering tool, and it was great. But you know, there is, you know, a ton of this material. The Ukrainians are undoubtedly playing a spectacularly successful information game. You know, almost all the videos we see are coming from the Ukrainians, not from the Russians. And so, you know, it is very easy to draw conclusions, for example, about the sheer volume of destruction of Russian equipment, which is awesome. But, you know, we're only seeing one version of that. So, you know, there's an awful lot of imagery to process. It can be done, but it does take time. And if you're stuck in your hotel room with nothing to do but stare at your computer screen, you can sort of figure it out.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think we might have Hind back. Hi, Hind, if you just joined us. I don't know whether you're there in terms of, you've unmuted, which is good, and we can see you again. Thanks.
Hi.
Where have you got to?
We're almost at the hotel. We're 30 minutes away, hopefully, so
okay. Okay, we've just been talking about propaganda, verification, whether it's quite hard sometimes to get to the truth in the fog of war, and how broadcasters are guarding against this or trying to guard against this. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, yes, I think we learned a lot from the wars in Syria and a lot of the other events that have taken place. I remember I was in the newsroom at Sky during the Arab Spring and the so-called Arab Spring now and beyond. And at the time, I remember videos coming through that were sometimes automatically tweeted out by people or shared, and it would then transpire later that video was from Lebanon or from a different place. And there were also different organizations, human rights organizations, that were popping up that then, you know, it turned out that they weren't even located in Syria, and they were quoting people dead and that sort of thing. So I think now, in terms of, most newsrooms have learned a lot and have come a long way. We've become accustomed to information wars, the use of the internet and social media, how important it is for us in order to get our work out there, but also the importance of verifying every information that you get, sitting on it, checking it, double checking it, where did this come from, not tweeting it out straight away or sharing it immediately. And I think that is something that everybody coming into this is aware of. And, you know, and even this war, we've seen, you know, certain stories that have come out that have then been questioned. Did this really happen? Is it true? So it is something that we're constantly keeping our eyes open for. But most of our reporting that we're doing now is all about on the ground information, speaking to people, and hearing from people's experiences and civilians who are still stuck in it.
Yeah, and Hind, I wondered, there has also been some criticism that the media coverage has been quite Western centric. Al Jazeera had a comment the other day saying media pundits and journalists and political figures have been accused of double standards for using their outlets to commend Ukraine's armed resistance to Russian troops, but also underlining their horror at how such a conflict could happen to a, quote, civilized nation. I wonder whether you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm hoping you can still hear me. I've turned the video off because reception.
Yeah, we can still hear you. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I mean, first of all, I have to say that there are lots of incredible journalists who are working on this, local journalists from Ukraine, people from outside. And, you know, there are people who are really doing some amazing work, colleagues who are here, we've all been in contact. So I have to say that first, but then of course it is frustrating when you hear certain things being repeated more than once. And at that point, you know, there has to be a level where you accept that there is some form of institutional problem that we have to deal with. And we know the reality is that we have to face is that journalism remains an elitist industry, right? So we've come a long way. We're seeing changes. The newsroom is looking different. There are different people who are being employed from different backgrounds. And I do think people are focusing on trying to change the demographic of the newsroom. But the reality is we're still disproportionately represented by people who have been to have private school backgrounds or from, you know, certain areas. And I think until we diversify journalism in a real way through managerial level, and I'm talking, you know, race and class. Class is incredibly important. As someone who comes from Hull and not hearing too many people who sound like me, you know, in conflict zones or in war zones, I think until you diversify the newsroom, you're not going to get the diversification of information. And unless you have people who can relate to different scenarios on the ground, you're never going to get the complete picture. And again, that is to emphasize, I have seen, even in my time as a journalist, incredible change, really great change, and a real effort by, you know, managers across the board to try and deal with this. But it's still a big problem, and we still need to try to counteract that. I know personally, watching Channel 4, Sky News, BBC, I've seen changes, and, you know, it makes me smile when I hear somebody with a regional accent talking. And so it is definitely something that is getting better, but there is a long way to go in order for us to be able to really represent the stories that we're seeing.
Yeah, agreed. Hind, thank you very much. I've got some questions coming in from the audience, so I wonder whether I can put these to you. There's a question from Liz to you, Rachel, really. Following your advice, do you anticipate broadcasters being required to warn viewers on difficult content? When do you make the decision to say these are distressing images?
So that exists already. It's part of our kind of Ofcom requirements, and it's part of our responsibility as public service broadcasters. And clearly there's different bulletins and different times of the day, and there are images we would show on News at 10 across a range of stories that perhaps we wouldn't put on our evening news. I think it's something we discuss all the time. And I think with this conflict, we have shown perhaps some more distressing images than we might have done in others. And there's been a big discussion around that. And there's been some horrible images of people who've been injured. And again, we have talked through what we will put on at certain times and what we'll put on others, but they all pretty much would always come with a warning. And I think it's around physical images, whether they're gory, for want of a better word, but also there is the sort of psychological trauma of things as well. And often it's the build-up of 3 or 4 images. So the report we showed last night from Mariupol on News at 10, actually the first 3 images all showed people who were dead, and it was that sort of cumulative at the top of the piece, which particularly we therefore felt we needed to spell out much more. Actually, this isn't just a difficult piece from a war zone. This one is exceptional. It had a bigger warning with it. So I think it's there. I think it's there in place, and I think we are doing it. I think this war is perhaps seeing a bit more across the board, I think on all broadcasters, but I think we've all been very careful to say why, and it hasn't become gratuitous or used for horrible telly term, wallpaper. But yes, I think it's there, and I think we're doing it, and I think we need to keep doing it. And even if we are 2, 3, 4 months into this, we need to keep doing it.
We do. There's a question here from Louise. Jonathan, if I can put this to you, how do you balance the showing of human interest stories of the conflict versus a more analytical overview? We touched on this a bit earlier, but how do you think you're doing it at Sky?
That's a very good question. Yeah, part of war, as Paul was talking about earlier, is quite dry and analytical, and is about maps and troop movements and territory and weaponry. The great advantage of as a kind of broadcasters is the ability to bring human stories to life through video. So you're always looking for human stories. That has particularly come in this way geographically on the margins of the conflict, interestingly, because there's been this incredible exodus of people driving out of Ukraine into the neighboring countries, and some of the most powerful human stories have come from that, and just the idea of people having to, from one day to the next, having to pick themselves up and leave their home, and in this conflict often women and children leaving sons and husbands and what have you, because they're staying home to fight, is so universal and so powerful. Actually, John, one of our correspondents who we were pulling out for a bit, he's just gone back, John Sparks, was in Dnipro in the east, and we wanted to bring him out through Lviv in the west, and he actually took the train that many people were taking to leave the country, and it was perhaps the most powerful human piece that we have told, and that there wasn't an explosion or a gunshot or a artillery shell in it. It was just an incredibly touching portrayal of a universal human experience that has been happening through the ages, and is such a kind of horrific but absolute irreducible element of conflict. So I think for us as broadcasters, you're always looking for those human stories. As I say, in this story, it's come from that in particular.
Yeah. And one for you, Paul, from Anonymous. You touched on it earlier, but how hard is it to verify social media accounts' footage? How important is being impartial when reviewing these accounts?
I mean, it is hard. We have, we all have teams now who do this technical work, and sometimes they're absolutely swamped, because you're seeing stuff in the field and you're thinking, well, that's that looks great, that feels like we ought to use that, but you've got to make sure that the team in London check it over, geolocate it, figure out if it's come from a completely different country in a different war. Yeah. These things are doable. There are some bits of footage that end up just you can't, because for some reason or another that data is not available. But it isn't. I mean, the impartiality thing is a strange. When you're in a city, and I referred to this earlier on, when you were in Sarajevo back in the 90s and Kiev now, you're sharing the experience of the citizens of the city that is under attack. You're sharing it probably in a slightly 5-star version, but nevertheless you're sheltering in the basement of your hotel or whatever. And so it's very, very easy to start getting into the mindset of we're all in this together. This is us. And so, and by us, you mean, you know, your journalistic colleagues and the people of the city around you. Sarajevo as a youngish reporter back then, it was intoxicating. It was romantic. You became incredibly attached to the place. That will happen, and it's already happening in Kiev and elsewhere. And that is something that is perfectly natural, and you shouldn't be ashamed of it. It's a human reaction, but it can lead you down avenues and of interpretation about imagery and storylines that you've got to be careful about. You've got to kind of constantly be questioning yourself about.
Well, it does mean you're taking sides. And we very obviously, I say we, as the media, have very obviously taken sides. And we are with the Ukrainian people, not with the Russian people, because of various difficulties working with Moscow. So, I mean, do you think that there's more of that in this? And of course, you know, when we talk about social media, then the Ukrainians using Zelensky making very good use of social media and stories about sort of soldiers marrying on the front line and civilians taking up arms. You know, all the social media is being used on both sides, but it appears as though the media has said, yeah, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys.
I mean, yeah, I mean, you know, you have to get, you know, back to the fundamental truth, which is that this was an unprovoked assault on a democratic country, which was, you know, which anyone who was there at the time knew that all of Moscow's narratives about, you know, the Ukrainians were preparing to launch an assault on the Donbass. They had, you know, chemical weapons that were being stored. All of this was complete and utter nonsense. And so there is a fundamental, I mean, I can't think of a conflict that I've covered which felt less grey.
Right. Yeah. You
know, this really doesn't feel grey.
No, absolutely. Rachel, you wanted to make a point.
I totally agree. And I still think you can remain impartial, but I think one thing that we've talked about is we shouldn't lose our empathy when it comes to Russians who have been killed in this. And, you know, we've watched our scripting and things when there perhaps has been a body bag of a Russian soldier. There's still somebody who's tragically died there, and there's still a family grieving somewhere for them. And I think holding on to your compassion through it still makes it okay to be mostly telling the story of the horror that Ukrainians are going through.
And I'm assuming that is why I suspect none of our organizations have shown the live press conferences with Russian prisoners of war who have been paraded, let's use that term, by the Ukrainians for political purposes, because they're willing to say that they were conscripts, that they were there against their will, they didn't know that they were fighting. The Ukrainians have had almost daily press conferences with prisoners of war. And I know that from the BBC, judging by the conversations I've seen on our chats, we're not touching any of that with a barge pole.
Yeah. All right. Just want to go for. I think we've lost Hind, but we're coming right to the end, and we could, I know, go on for another hour talking about this. Thank you for all your comments and questions if you sent them in. By the way, I just want to mention this from Graham, who said this event is a reminder of how lucky the UK is to have these news broadcasters and the teams doing such brilliant work reporting the facts. However, his question is, what impact does it have covering such an important news event on news budgets? Well, just come out of a pandemic as well, haven't we? So I imagine the news budgets are going to be, that's a decision to be taken further down the line, yes?
Above my pay grade.
No, above your pay grade, yeah. Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, we are very lucky to have a lot of support from ITV, who are understanding the importance of this for viewers and know that there is a thirst for that. So we are being given the resources to do extra programming and to cover what we are. And I think it's important, and we're seeing viewers and users across digital as well wanting it for the moment. So it's important to fund it.
Listen, thank you so much for being with us, those who are watching live and those who will be catching up for this RTS session on the fog of war. Thanks to our panel, Hind Hassan, Paul Adams, Rachel Cork and Jonathan Levy. Of course, our thoughts are always with the journalists in Ukraine and back at home who are bearing witness to this horrible conflict and putting themselves at risk as they do so. I'm Sian Williams. Thanks again. Bye-bye.